Hello, everyone. Welcome to Conversations with TEDxYangon. My name is Thiri, and I'll be your host for today. First, a little bit about TEDxYangon. We are a volunteer-run organization based in Yangon, Myanmar, and we come together under the banner of the TED Talks initiative called TEDx, which are independent community organized events. And we have been, over the last 5 years, arranging annual TED-like conferences that are called TEDxYangon, where we bring together a group of speakers who get on our stage and spread ideas. And very recently, we started this conversation series, which is a slightly different take on this idea sharing. And here we spend over an hour with interesting individuals. And because of the format, interesting individuals from around the world, where we discuss their ideas, their experiences, their thoughts, and also invite the audience to participate via questions. So if you're tuning in, on Facebook, please type in questions that you may have, and we'll be weaving them throughout the conversation today. I want to give a big shout out to all of our volunteer team members who are supporting this effort. We have our curation team members manning the question box for you so that we can get them in the right places. We have the team from Selwyn Group who sponsor us pro bono and doing the production today. Thank you, guys. We really cannot do this without all the various volunteers that come to support us. I'm extremely excited because so far we've had a number of very diverse conversations. We kicked off this series with historian and author Dr. Tham Mien U and discussed about the history of this country that we live in, Myanmar, and more importantly, the futures and the various possible futures that we can imagine. And then we followed with the MMA one champion, Aung Lang San, also called the Burmese Python. And we just had fantastic conversation about his outlook on life and the philosophy that he has, and of course learned a little bit about fighting as well. And we had Alison Langdon, who is in Australia. She's a reporter. She used to be with 60 Minutes. Now she's with the Today Show. And we talked a lot about media and journalism today and how things have changed so much in the last 2-3 decades and how media has completely affected the way that we live and trust the news that we read. And today we take a completely different slant. So it is 9 o'clock, just past 9 o'clock a.m. on Sunday, Yangon time. And I am joined by Dr. Stevan Gilmore, who is in Houston at the moment. It's 9:30 p.m. Saturday, so the day before. And Steve is a flight surgeon. And for those of you who don't know what a flight surgeon is, a flight surgeon in NASA is a doctor who looks after astronauts. And there's Steve right there in one of the vehicles that transport the astronauts. Before you just saw a photo in front of a big rocket. So we today are going to be exploring space, and in particular, what a flight surgeon does to help astronauts prepare for space and what astronauts do in space in terms of medical research and also the various types of missions that NASA has and Steve in particular has been involved in. So just a little bit more about Steve. Hello, Steve. Good morning, Steve. I have here, good morning and good evening to you. I have here a very, very long CV, resume, but so I'm not going to read all of it out, but you've been with NASA for quite a while now. You've been involved since 2002, if I'm reading this correctly. And in addition to being a NASA flight surgeon, you're also an emergency room physician. You're involved in quite a few different things, and you actually have a very, very strong interest in technology. We may or may not get to that, but you're a lead flight surgeon. And one of the missions that you supported was the Year in Space, which is one of NASA's exciting programs because this is the first time where a man, a human being, spent a year in space. So we'll discuss a little bit about that as well.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak with you, and I'm really looking forward to telling you about my experiences and a little bit more about what NASA's doing.
Fantastic. So I think we'll just kick off. For most people, you don't know what a flight surgeon is. I think most people think actually we did a translation for this event, and our translator translated it as a surgeon. As in somebody who goes into an operating room with a scalpel and operate on humans. But that's not what a flight surgeon is. A flight surgeon is a physician. And it's such a specific career in a lot of ways, looking after astronauts, looking at aerospace medicine. So what got you interested in it? As a little boy, were you fascinated with space? Well, what led you to this path right now?
Well, it's a great question. Growing up as a little kid, my family, we had a Time Life series of books, and one of them was about the Apollo missions. And I think, like a lot of Americans, for me at least, NASA seemed like something that was something you read about and maybe saw it a little bit about on a TV. It just wasn't very accessible. But as I grew up, I went to university and I majored in chemistry, and then ultimately went to medical school. And while I was in my third year of medical school, I went to a speech that was given by a physician that was an astronaut, but also he was a Navy physician, and he was talking about opportunities in the military and in the federal government, and also at NASA. And when you're in medical school, when you're in your final year, you get the opportunity to do a few clerkships and external rotations outside of the medical center to try different experiences. And after going to listen to that physician astronaut from the Navy speaking, I researched opportunities at the Kennedy Space Center and at the Johnson Space Center here in Houston, Texas. And I finished medical school in 1998, and when I went down to do the clerkship at the Kennedy Space Center, that was when the shuttle program was extremely active. They were doing between 3 to 5 shuttle launches a year. And the month I was at the Kennedy Space Center, I got to see one launch and a landing 2 weeks later, and then they were prepping another shuttle for a launch, which happened about 3 or 4 days after I left. And so that was a lot of fun. I was just so impressed and amazed at how much access as medical students we had when we were on the facility. We got to see the vehicles, go on the launch tower. We even got to fly in some helicopters and do a training event where they practice some of the emergency scenarios that can happen related to the launch sequences. So, as you could imagine, I was just really impressed with that experience. And I did a second month clerkship here in Houston later in that year, in 1998, at the Johnson Space Center. And at the Johnson Space Center, so if I just take a step back, Kennedy Space Center is probably what most people think of when they think of NASA, because that's where the vehicles, the rockets get launched into space. Houston at the Johnson Space Center is where astronauts primarily live and do all their training. And then Houston is actually the control center for the human space program. So we have a control center here as well. So that was my initial entry into the field, and I just, after those 2 clerkships in my medical school experience, I just looked for continued opportunities to stay involved, and ultimately that landed me here at Houston with the job at NASA.
Do you have to have any specialized training? I know being a doctor in of itself is a very, very long process. And most people, when they specialize, again, I have doctor friends who are still studying well into our age now, in our 40s, to be a flight surgeon at NASA. Sounds like you might need some specialized training. What additional training did you have to have?
So, as you mentioned, after I got out of med school, I did a 3-year residency in emergency medicine and completed that. And to your question, there's a specific residency related to aerospace medicine. And for the viewers, aerospace medicine is a pretty small specialty amongst all the medical specialties, but it's a 2-year program. And the primary things that we focus on are related to human physiology and the different kinds of extreme environments that people go into, whether it be mountain climbing and high altitude physiology or diving medicine where you're underwater and under increased amounts of pressure. We also focus on acceleration and the effects on the human body. The place where most people would be familiar with what a aerospace medicine specialist does is related to commercial aviation. All the commercial pilots have to pass a special medical exam that's typically given by someone with some qualifications in aerospace medicine.
Okay, great. Let's dive in. You've been in 3 shuttle missions and 6 station missions, I believe. For those of us who are only familiar with NASA through the news and through movies, those sound quite fascinating. And what does it mean? What's the difference between a shuttle mission and a station mission?
Well, the primary difference was duration of the flight. The shuttle missions were typically, in the early days, they were 3 to 5 day missions, and at their longest, they were up towards 17 days. A mission on the space station is typically a 6-month mission in space, and you can take the other primary difference is that a mission on the space station, you can take one of a number of vehicles. In days past, when we were flying the shuttle would bring crews and help. It actually was critical in building the space station out. And then the other primary vehicle for getting up to the space station has been and continues to be the Russian Soyuz. And we're also in the process at NASA working with some commercial partners which are SpaceX and Boeing, to have rockets similar in appearance, at least, to the Soyuz rocket that uses sun.
Yeah. When we talk about station, is it just the International Space Station that is up there, the ISS, or are there any other ones that are floating around?
Well, currently the ISS is the primary station, at least as it relates to NASA's activities. Um, the Chinese do have a human space flight program as well, but for the International Space Station, our partners are obviously NASA's involved, the European Space Agency, the Russian Space Agency is also involved, and the Japanese Space Agency and the Canadian Space Agency. So those are the 5 primary partners for the International Space Station.
Right. So we were talking about these missions and going back to the fact that your primary responsibility is to help astronauts prepare for their missions. Can we get into what does it require? What does it take? Actually, let's start with what does it take to be an astronaut these days? We used to, I think, in the old days, have the perception that astronauts are these superhumans who need to be able to withstand all sorts of extreme tests, and now I think things have changed as technology has changed as well. So, what does it take to become an astronaut these days?
Well, as you mentioned, what they're looking for has changed a little bit over time, but they're obviously astronauts and cosmonauts are still remarkable people. So primarily what they're looking for, there's a few criteria that they have, but they're looking at people primarily with STEM educations because of the type of research that they're doing. They're also looking for people with um, experience with flying and aviation. You don't have to be a pilot to become an astronaut. But I think one of the primary things that they all have in common is they're very determined and motivated people. You were talking about the length of time that it takes to become, for example, a physician, but the delayed gratification that it takes to become an astronaut is even greater. Um, Many of these professionals, it's the culmination of essentially their lifetime's worth of work when they actually do their missions. So uh, the primary thing that I would say is folks are real determined and motivated and keeping this long-term goal of theirs in sight. There's a couple
So
other
you,
components that are pretty key to it too. You have to be, I think the kind of people they're looking for are folks that are interested in not necessarily danger, but they're working on things that are on new frontiers or where they're exposed to a little bit of risk, and they're also team players, and they're able to communicate really well in those environments where they're under a little bit more stress than the average person experiences.
right. And they're physicians. So in terms of the medical needs, what kind of medical tests do they need to pass to become an astronaut?
So when NASA picks astronauts, they usually do it. They call it their astronaut selection process, and they actually have a selection process out now. And typically, what happens is people will submit their CV and an application, and NASA. I think the current cycle they've had. Well, let me say the last cycle, I think they had between 12 to 15,000 applicants for around 10 to 12 spots. So it's very competitive. And NASA invites candidates that they're interested in down to the Space Center. And then as you mentioned, we do a screening medical exam on them. It involves some blood tests, fitness evaluations, and then we also do a variety of different kind of imaging exams, just to make sure that we're screening out. We're looking for potential medical conditions that could cause a problem that might arise on the duration of the flight. That's the main concern that we're looking for medically.
Right. And I think we actually, for the conversations, we always do a little bit of prep. Not too much, so that we don't take away from the free flowing nature. But this one we did look, and for the more detail oriented among us, there is disqualifications there. So you had given us the statistics of one of your colleagues wrote a summary of medical disqualifications on astronaut selection over the last 30-year period. Visual comes up at the top at 38%, cardiovascular at 14%, psychiatric behavioral 9%, and then goes on and goes on. But it's neurological, endocrine, gastrointestinal, pulmonary, hematology, and so on. But it's quite basic, right? Visually, why is visual so important? Is it that you don't accidentally press the wrong button? You need to be able to operate controls. Cardiovascular, I can imagine you don't want people having heart attacks. This is a simple layperson way of interpreting that.
Yeah, the information that you referenced was the summary of selection during the shuttle program, and vision was a big eliminator for a couple reasons. One, they needed to be sure about the piloting capabilities. There's a commander and a pilot of the shuttle, and when the shuttle returned to Earth, it basically returned as a glider, which meant that it had one opportunity to get the landing right. So they wanted to make sure that people had good eyesight so they could do that well. The other reason that the visual system and eyes were the lead in terms of what kept people from being astronauts is that we didn't have the same kind of refractive surgeries that we have now, where people can get 20/20 vision as a result. Uh, and NASA tends to be a little bit it tends to be a little bit lagging in terms of following medical trends. So we tend to like to see things like refractive surgery, like LASIK, for example. We want to see that demonstrated to be effective and working well without any complications for a long period of time. So typically what you'll see is the military branches may adopt, and actually in this case, military branches did adopt LASIK surgery before we did, and then ultimately we accept astronauts that have had that surgery in the past. But that's one of the reasons why the visual system was the main reason that people didn't pass medical.
That makes sense. Did you ever want to become an astronaut?
I think like a lot of people that work at the Space Center, I certainly had an interest. But the key part of that is that NASA has to have there's only a few people that know exactly what it is that they're looking for in their candidates, and so and obviously, as I mentioned before, it's very competitive. So they have a great way of reaching out to find great people that'll be assets to the program.
Be quite fascinating to be out in space.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask about how you prepare crew for space, and I'm going to ask Frank, our producer, to see if he can put those photos back, Frank, the ones from starting from maybe that big swimming pool. We can take a look at the size of that facility first, and then see. So that's what are we looking at, Steve?
So this is a facility here in Houston called the Neutral Buoyancy Lab, and as you mentioned, it's an extremely large swimming pool where they have life-size versions of modules of the space station, and that are submerged in the pool. You can see the outlines sort of in white in the center of the pool there, and the pool's roughly three stories in depth. And so the astronauts will get in the spacewalking suits and go into the pool, and it provides for them a training environment which is very similar to being on an actual spacewalk where there's no gravity. They use the buoyancy to sort of get a little bit of an experience of what it will be like when they're on an actual spacewalk. So you can see in this photo here, two crew members have gotten suited up and they're being lowered down into the pool. And then there's a large complement of safety divers there in the pool with them that help get them around to the various modules where they practice assembling things, practice emergency procedures. And usually these training runs usually last about 6 hours. So the better part of the day, two crew members would be practicing training for spacewalks.
Right. And when you say crew, you mean the astronauts, right?
Yes, sorry, the astronauts. That's correct.
We'll use crew for the rest of we'll get in the lingo. We'll use crew for the rest of the conversation. But when you first mentioned it, when we were having our prep, I was like, crew? Oh, of course, that's the astronauts. For us, it's the astronauts, So yeah, so with the crew that you work with for the various missions, how long does it take? How far in advance do you have to start preparing people physically and everything else for them to go into space?
So typically the way it works is In the shuttle days, crews would get assigned, the astronauts would get assigned to the mission, between 1.5 to 2 years out from the mission. But prior to that, their job and responsibility was to acquire these skills like training in the pool there for spacewalks. So they would have already completed a baseline set of training, and then they get named to a mission, as I said, roughly about 2 years beforehand, and then they do very specific types of training for the activities that they're going to plan to do on that mission, and um, and they'll like I say they'll take about 2 years to get them totally ready, and then they'll go launch and execute a mission. It's roughly similar for a station mission nowadays, where they're spending roughly that much time in training. The big difference between the training for shuttle ops and station ops is that the crew members are, for that period of time, that training period, they're constantly traveling to the various international partner centers to receive the various types of training that they offer. So they spend a lot of time on the road in the training phase before the mission for for a flight to the station.
Frank, can we have that photo again with the VR? The lady with the VR, I think, just so that Steve can talk to what she's doing right there.
Yeah, this is an astronaut by the name of Sunita Williams, and she's actually going to be flying probably next year to the space station on the new Boeing vehicle, one of the new Boeing vehicles. But the training she's demonstrating or actually doing here is a VR goggle, a virtual reality goggle system that they use in conjunction with spacewalk training. It allows it, the view is obviously a very high fidelity view of the outside of the space station. And I believe they also use it to simulate a little bit one of the emergency tools that they have on the spacesuit, which is called the Safer, which is a little, if you will, a jetpack that would allow them to maneuver back to station if for some reason they became untethered.
Right. And I think we have more photos of sort of the modules, the mock-up modules that you have in the training center, where the astronauts can go in and do the training. So what are we looking at here? Is this supposed to be the ISS?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. This is a building called Building 9 here at the Houston Space Center, and they have essentially a full mock-up of all the modules that are the pressurized modules of the station, the modules that the crew can live and work in. And this isn't the photo that you're looking at now is a picture. It's also from Building 9. The vehicle in the forefront is a new vehicle that astronauts haven't flown on yet, but is scheduled to fly in the springtime of 2021, and that's the Boeing capsule. And then in the background, there's a second capsule for the Orion program that's also being developed. But here again, you can see some the mock-ups for the space station itself, and these are essentially life-size. You can go inside them. And so what happens is the crew spend a lot of time training in these modules for the various tasks that they'll perform on a day-to-day basis while they're on a mission to the space station. And the kind of tasks they have to learn are, for example, the emergency procedures. The astronauts and the cosmonauts are, if there were to be a fire, they're the fire response. If one of the modules got penetrated and there's losing atmosphere, they have to know how to safe themselves and safe the vehicle. So those emergency procedures they train. They also just train day-to-day procedures, how to work the kitchen or the galley as we call it, how to warm up food. The food system is its own special thing. They also learn how to repair the payloads or the scientific equipment that they work with. They learn how to repair the station. Um, and all the kinds of tasks that you could possibly think of, they use these types of lockups to perform that training.
Do you have any statistics on the percentage of crew who's gone through training but don't make it in the end because they develop health problems or things change? That must be heartbreaking after all that training.
Well, I don't have specific numbers, but in in the NASA system, basically they select classes of astronauts, and so there's basically so now it's a several year period where you are an astronaut candidate, and after my best analogy is it's to me it looks from the outside kind of like being in graduate school. They bring very capable, accomplished people in. You have several years of training where you learn how to fly in the NASA jets. You learn the spacewalking skills. You learn all about the systems of station, and that's like I said, a roughly 2 year program. And after that point, that group of astronauts become selected as officially trained and selected as astronauts. And after that point, after that point where they complete that astronaut candidate phase, it's not 100%, but virtually all those individuals end up flying on missions. The number of missions each individual person flies varies for a variety of reasons. Some people stay for their entire career. Some people stay for a shorter period of time and go on to other professional endeavors. Sometimes a medical condition might impact a crew member's decision about how long their career at NASA will be. But most of the time, it's other considerations, not medical ones, that determine how long an astronaut stays active at NASA and how many missions they fly.
Let's look at some launch photos. So you mentioned the Kennedy Space Center, the Johnson Space Center. Launch is done as part of the International Space Program. Launch is done in a few places in the world. Can you talk us about where those are, what the crew has to do to prepare for that launch itself?
So you're looking at some images here of a shuttle launch, and that takes place, as I mentioned earlier, at the Kennedy Space Center. So preparation for launch, at least from the medical perspective, it's not my perspective, but from the medical perspective, we're doing a couple things or several things before crew members and missions fly. Crew will have an annual medical examination, and we'll work with them on anything that comes up and make sure that they're medically cleared for flight. The other main thing that we're doing in the medical system is not all the missions to space have someone with medical experience, like a physician or an EMT level trained person on them. So in the medical system, what we do is we have a system of training of medical skills that we provide to the astronauts, so that if it's needed on a mission that they have to give medicine or repair a cut or laceration, for example, or other types of, or even draw blood, those types of things, we train them, give them training on how to do that. So that's part of our systems, the medical systems preparation for astronauts going into space. And then as you get closer to the launch, we do some additional things to help make sure that crew members don't get sick around the time of launch. And what we do there is we establish a quarantine for the crew. So roughly about 2.5 weeks before a launch, we'll start restricting access to the crew, so that only essential people are in direct contact with them. And all those individuals, including the crew, have to be screened to make sure that they don't have any you know, that they don't have the flu or the common cold that they would transmit to the crew. So we start that quarantine process here in Houston, and then it varies a little bit, but roughly a week to 10 days before the flight, they'll transfer with the crew down to the Kennedy Space Center and complete the quarantine period there before crews launch into space, or the crew members launch into space.
The word quarantine, of course, brings up the question of COVID. Has the COVID-19 pandemic affected the programs that you run at all, and if so, in what way?
Uh, it's had a big impact to how we do operations. Um, Although we've shown some photos of space shuttle launch, recently most of our launches have been with our international partners, the Russians, on their Soyuz vehicles. So uh, our crew members are going to Russia to launch from there on that vehicle before they fly. So the training phase for, as I mentioned earlier, the training phase for crew members going to the station requires, in the past, it required that they travel to all the five international partner training centers. And so COVID and the pandemic impacts have had a big impact on how we would normally train our crew, because obviously there's not many commercial air flights anymore. And obviously, as you might guess, the crew members are the center of attention and around a lot of people. So we've had to put in, I won't say that we've extended the quarantine all the way back into the training period, but we've really had to restrict the number of people that can access the crew during the training phase, and also make sure that everyone's using the right level of personal protective equipment like masks and this type of thing, to make sure that we're not transmitting or exposing the crew to a higher risk of contracting COVID. So the short answer to your question is, has there been impacts? Yeah, there's been the impacts, and but we've been able to manage making sure the crew have the critical training that they need. We had a crew return. Well, we've had two crews return from station. One returned recently on the SpaceX vehicle, Dragon, uh, roughly a month ago, and then we had a crew return on the Soyuz in Kazakhstan back in roughly April. So obviously, both of those times, COVID was going on, and so, like I said, we really had to re-look at how we did those operations, but we were able to do them successfully from the perspective of preventing illness for the crew.
Right. Let's look at some crew before launch. We I think we've got two sets of photos. First, a crew launching. Okay, this is Steve. Why don't you let us know what's happening here?
So this is a photo from day of launch. This is what's called suit up. So a typical launch day, crew will wake up roughly 6 hours before launch. They'll take some personal time. They'll stop by our medical office that's in the suit up facility, and we'll do a final medical exam, and then they'll go do the suit up, as that first photo was, where that was Leland Melvin, who was suiting up for a shuttle flight. And this is where they get their spacesuits on. They make sure they have all the equipment, everything that they had planned to have in their pockets. They make sure that they'll. I didn't include a photo here, but they'll put their helmets on and do a pressure test to make sure that the spacesuit is working. And then they'll proceed out to the launch vehicle and get in it, and hopefully launch into space. One of the unique things about the Cape is the Kennedy Space Center, sorry, also referred to as the Cape. And there's a shuttle crew walking out. You can see the silver Astra van behind them. They'll get in that vehicle and drive out to the launch pad, and then get into the vehicle. And one of the unique things about the Cape is on the coast. It's on the coast of Florida, but the unique thing is there's a lot of storms and weather. So it's not uncommon that due to weather or sometimes mechanical reasons that in the shuttle days they would have to scrub a mission. So you might get more than one attempt at launching a shuttle crew into space. There were some other photos in there, which were suit ups for for a flight on the Russian vehicle, and those were the spacesuits where the individuals were in a white spacesuit. Yeah, you can see this gentleman's a physician. He's from Canada. His name's Dr. David Sajak. But he's getting into what's called the Russian Sokol suit there, and that's their launch and entry suit. And so after they get the suit on, there's some additional photos, but they'll do a brief press conference. You can see this is a NASA astronaut, Anne McClain, in the final phases of getting her suit on, getting ready to go out for the final briefing that they have with the Russian Commission that helps certify that the vehicle is ready to go. And I think there's some additional photos in there where there's a little bit of time in all this process. You can imagine this is a really busy sequence of events, but there's time in there I think there's a photo of one of the crew members talking with their family. You can see the crew members in quarantine, which means they're behind glass, but they can speak through there to their family and friends that have been invited to come and observe the launch. So it's like I say, an exciting day, no matter how you look at it. But there's definitely lots going on, and families are an important part of seeing their spouses and family members on.
So, as the doctor, you must worry for your crew once they are, when the shuttles launch. Where are you typically? Are you're far back from the launch? Do you go to watch the launch at the physical side? Are you at mission control? What happens?
So when we were launching shuttles, when you were one of the physicians supporting a mission, if you were the lead physician, you would go out and the closest you could get to a shuttle launch was 3 miles away. So you would be at a triage site with some medical forces that were staged there in case there was a launch contingency. Uh, and for the medical team, we always assign 2 people to support each crew in case something happens to one or the other of us. But the second physician would go. There's a control center at the Kennedy Space Center that's responsible for making sure the rocket's ready to launch and managing that launch process. And the second physician would go inside to the control center there at the Kennedy Space Center and participate in the launch countdown. So we would be on site at the launch for launches to Soyuz, or for launches to the station from Soyuz. Both docs, both physicians would be at the launch site, and because the vehicle is a bit smaller than the shuttle was, we're staged roughly a mile to a mile and a half away from the launch site. And you basically are waiting with everyone else to see the successful launch there. At the Russian launch site, there's also contingency plans and a medical team that we participate in if that were to come to pass. But that's where we're stationed at.
Just as an aside, you learned Russian in is it university or even before? Has it come useful in all the various international corporations that you're doing?
Well, my Russian medical counterparts are very gracious, and they'll suffer through my attempts to speak Russian. I actually learned to speak a bit of Russian because we have a medical clinic over in Russia at the Gagarin Training Center where the cosmonauts train. And so I spent a few years supporting our crew over there in Russia. And during that time, I picked up I would say that my Russian skills at the time were reasonable, not great, but reasonable. I haven't had as much opportunity recently to maintain it, but it's definitely a great relationship that we have with the medical group amongst all the international partners. But doing what you can, obviously, to learn your colleagues' language, I think goes a long ways.
Once the astronauts are in space, what are your primary responsibilities? How do you look after them all, between you being in Houston and them being in space?
So our duties focus on two main things. One, we're essentially on call for any type of medical question or condition that might arise. And then our other important or key role is we're involved with the control teams that are planning the mission. And so after a launch, regardless of where it is, whether it's in Russia or in Florida, we come back to Houston and then we participate with the ground control teams. We have a console in the control room, and we help plan the crew day. We get involved with how many hours in the day that the crew are scheduled. We monitor certain types of scientific investigations. We monitor spacewalks. You can see this is part of our I won't call it medical equipment, but we have it's part of the medical system, which is the training equipment that the crew used. Physical training and exercise is one of the primary countermeasures that we use to work to basically to counteract the fact that the crew aren't exposed to any gravity during the course of their mission. And so the first photo was a treadmill. This is an upgraded. That's the older treadmill called Tevis that they used, and they also the next photo they have what this shows is a device called the Advanced Resistive Exercise Device, or ARED, and basically it provides the capability to lift weights, if you will. Obviously, it's not the way the system works, since they're weightless up there, is there's a big vacuum canister that you're pulling against the force of a vacuum, so it simulates weightlifting in that way. But crews spend, as I mentioned earlier, about 2.5 hours a day on the various exercise devices to maintain their work capacity and to counteract some of the changes that happen to the body, primarily muscle. If you didn't do exercise, you'd lose a lot of muscle strength and you'd lose a lot of or bone mass or skeletal calcium. So working out maintains those body systems while crew are on station. So we're involved in that system, and that takes up some of the activities that we do. The other important part of our job is to some extent staying involved or getting to know the crew members' families and being available to them if something arises. It's easy, I won't say it's easy to forget, but obviously most people see the astronauts when they're on their mission. They don't so much see their families, but life goes on for families on the ground, particularly during a 6-month mission. Anything and everything can and has happened. So we just keep conversation open with families to make sure that they're doing well, and if there's anything that's needed there, we help with our team members to help provide that.
So this is a bit of a not quite a segue, but a reintro. So all this conversation is happening because we were having Steve and I were in a video chat. So for the audience, Steve's actually my brother-in-law. My husband Kevin is his brother. And we recently had a baby. Our baby's almost 1 now, but we're having one of those family calls with the baby. And Steve went, actually, the astronauts get really freaked out because their feet, when they're in space, become smooth and soft like baby's feet. And then what else happens to human bodies when they're in space? And then subsequently, I was speaking with my TEDx team, and I said, my brother-in-law Steve is a NASA flight surgeon, and he said that wouldn't that be fascinating to talk to him about what he does, and they're like, absolutely. Which is what led us to this conversation, and inviting you to speak and spend time with us. And thank you again for doing that. So you just start again with, in addition to just your feet turning into baby seat, and why does that happen, and what else, what other funny things happen to a human body in space?
Yeah, yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I had one of the one of the family members asked me that same question recently. It seems to surprise crew and their family. Um, and kind of think that sort of message would get maybe passed down. But to answer your question, because when you're in space, you basically are weightless, so you're not spending any time really walking on your feet, and so that callous layer of skin, or that thick layer of skin basically isn't needed. You saw some examples of people running on the treadmill, but they might do that for 45 minutes in a day. So your body is real responsive to the environment and the stresses around it. And if you don't you've heard the use it or lose it saying, if you're not using stuff, um, you don't need it. And so as it relates to the soles of their feet, roughly a month and a half or 2 months into a 6 month mission, it's pretty common that the bottoms of the soles of the crew members' feet will basically slough off, and then the skin underneath obviously is real soft, like baby's feet. So that's kind of funny. It's not funny, but it's a unique thing that happens. You don't see that happen in too many other places. You'd asked earlier about the things that I look at and worry about. When we're in the control center, I like to listen to the loops, the conversation between space and ground as much as I can, and watch my crew members on video when I can to see what they're doing. One of my crew members, I noted one time on the video that it looked like he had a mark on one of his fingers, and I sent him an email and said, "Hey, is there something you want to tell me about what happened today?" And he kind of laughed about how observant that I was. That I noticed he pinched his finger between two pieces of something on station and had a little bruise on the end of his finger. But I think the bigger story there is just medically, you get to know your crew members pretty well before they leave, such that you can hear differences in their voice, if that happens, whether that's stress or other things. And then it's important just to be observant to see if you can identify things in video, because we only get to talk to them roughly once a week after the mission gets started. Obviously, this example that I talked about with this crew member and his finger was a pretty minor thing, but I think he was surprised that I was able to notice that. There's other medical. Sorry, go ahead.
Please, no, please go ahead. I was just going to ask Frank later on if we can have that photo from Mission Control, but please continue, Steve.
We do measure changes in most of the body systems, and so when astronauts first get into space, they experience a complex of symptoms that's called space motion sickness. It's the same kind of symptoms that anyone would get if they get motion sick on a boat or in a car, where they can get nauseated, you feel tired, you want to lay down and get some rest to kind of help the symptoms pass. It's called space motion sickness because we can't really predict who's going to get it. You could be someone that never gets motion sickness in planes or on a boat, but you can get motion sickness in space. And we notice it when people get into bigger volumes and they're not restrained in their launch seat and able to float around, and when there's no gravity, you can use all the sides of the room as a surface. You can sit on the ceiling, you can sit on the walls, but it takes your brain a little bit of time to get used to the change in visual orientation. Yeah, you can see this is a crew member in the airlock for EVAs floating in there, but it just takes your nervous system a bit of time to adapt to the fact that you no longer have gravity and you can exist on all the surfaces in the room. So that's the primary reason why people get motion sick, and that can happen almost immediately in some cases when you get to space, but it usually clears up in the first couple days if you even experience it. And then throughout the mission, there's various changes in other body systems. Pretty shortly after you get into space, your body fluids change in a significant way. Your heart and blood vessels actually contain a reserve of fluid in it to help you do the work against gravity, so that if you stand up quickly or you get up from laying down quickly, you can maintain a relatively constant blood pressure. And then part of that reason is because you've got extra fluid that's in your legs and in the blood vessels in your legs. But when you go in space, there's no gravity, so you don't need any of that extra fluid, and so you end up getting rid it depends on how big you are, but you get rid of a significant or a small portion of that fluid. And so your body fluids change over the longer term, as we mentioned when we looked at some of the exercise equipment. Your body needs to work, otherwise you lose muscle strength and you also lose calcium from your bones. And those kind of changes take place over the course of weeks to months. But those are the kind of ways that your body changes. One new thing relatively new thing that we've noticed is that crew members, particularly on the longer duration flights, some of them are experiencing changes in their visual system. And what we've noticed about that is a person that wears glasses like myself, when they go into space, after a short period of time, the refraction or the strength of their prescription in their glasses, uh, it actually changes. And we noted that for a while, so our eye doctors are pretty good at estimating how much change a person will need, and so we fly glasses specific for that vision change that we expect to happen in space. But as we've had more experience and more people with 6 month or more experiences on the space station, after they've come back, we've been doing, and before they leave, actually, we've been doing some fairly complex MRI scans of their heads to try to understand why their visual system is changing. And they've noted some other changes that aren't really obvious on the outside, but when you look at a really detailed MRI, you can see that the nerve that goes into your eye starts becoming a little more, I'll just say, bendy or tortuous, and that's secondary to the exposure in space. And so the visual system changes a bit, and this is something that we're also monitoring to try to understand why it's happening, so that we can hopefully come up with some countermeasures like the physical exercises to prevent it from causing a problem for the visual system.
So some of the astronauts that you've worked on, you work with in NASA, have been the ones that have spent the longest time in space. Notably, astronaut Scott Kelly, who did the Year in Space mission, and I understand he has a twin brother who's also an astronaut. So you were able to do some twin studies, identical DNA, two individuals, one in space, one not. Any outcomes from that? That's interesting and that you can share?
Yeah, the Year in Space mission was a first for NASA from the point of view of that was the first time we had a crew member in space for significantly longer than a 6-month mission. Scott was up there for 340 days. It was kind of funny. He was trying to see if we could get him to stay up there a little bit longer, so there was a full calendar year, but that didn't happen for other reasons. But it turns out that our Russian colleagues, our Russian international partners, have had 4 individuals that have had missions in space longer than that, longer than a year. Those were all done on the Mir space station. Um, so NASA needed to NASA's working on getting their own experience with the astronauts on these longer duration missions. And the reason why that's important to us is we want to develop an experience base so that as we start executing or flying longer missions that go further away, say to the moon or potentially in the future to somewhere like Mars, those missions probably will require someone to be gone for a year, 1 to 3 years perhaps. And so we really have a ways to go to expand this knowledge base about how the body responds to being away from gravity and away from the protective layers of Earth for that long. Back to your question about what did we learn with the Year in Space mission. So during that year, Scott and his counterpart, he had a Russian cosmonaut that was also spent a year in space with him as well. They did roughly 400 different experiments while they're up there. And Scott, as you mentioned, has a twin brother who was also a NASA astronaut. And they used that opportunity to look at basically they're identical twins, so they had the opportunity to look at how Scott's body responded to being in space for a year while his brother was here in the here on the Earth in the States for that same year. And it was a very comprehensive set of studies that the twin studies were. It involved 10 investigations with about 84 different investigators at 12 different facilities. And they took a really close look at Scott from the level of what kind of changes were going on in his DNA, in his cells, and then kind of expanding that out to changes in his body related to his immune system, his we all have what's called a microbiome, which is the bacteria that are normally on us. They investigated how those changed as a result of being in space. They also looked at his cognitive performance while he was on his 1-year mission. The takeaway, 3 or 4 things that they learned from the investigation. Well, first off, I'll say Scott's high level was that he came back and he was taller than his brother for some period of time. He was kind of joking. Technically, crew members do get a little bit taller in space, but that change in height goes back to normal relatively quickly after they get back. But he liked to give his brother a hard time about being taller than him. But the scientific investigations showed that he did have changes in the types of genes that his chromosomes and DNA were expressing while he was in space. After he returned, the vast majority of that returned back to normal. We do see a little bit of change or damage, if you will, to astronauts' chromosomes as a result of the radiation environment that they're exposed to while they're in space. But typically, on the whole, that damage gets repaired when they get back, and we haven't seen long-lasting changes from that. There's a few photos out there of Scott giving himself a flu shot while he was on his 1-year mission, and this was part of an investigation to look into his immune system to see if it still responds in the same way after you're in space for a long period of time. And I believe the high-level results from that showed that, at least related to the flu shot, his body responded as yours or mine would if we got one here on the ground. One of the interesting things about his DNA that they're still looking at was there's this type of DNA called telomeres in your chromosomes, and that can be thought of as a bit of a pad or a buffer in the chromosome to help protect the genes that actually are needed to express proteins and other things that control the way the cells in the body works. So telomeres are thought to are typically known to decrease in amount when you're under stress and as you get older. It turns out that while Scott was in space, his telomeres actually expanded in size. And so we need to do some more studying to figure out why that may have happened. One of my theories is, and people may or may not know this about it, but the environment of the space station, the air, the water, in many ways the food, can be better than most of the environment that many people are exposed to on the ground. And, the air is very clean. The systems that they have to maintain it keep it very, very good. Same for the water. So relative to the average person on the ground, those types of things are actually at a higher level than someone on the ground. So from that perspective, there's fewer stresses. Obviously, one of the differences, as I mentioned, is the radiation environment that the crew are exposed to. So that's a source of stress. And to just kind of summarize the last part of it, I think what they learned from the genetic studies is they're looking at a set of some genes that they could potentially use to monitor how crew are responding to spaceflight in the future. And that's a study that's still underway.
Okay, great. Actually, well, there are a few more things that we did want to get through, but like to pause and take a few of the questions that there's been quite a few questions that have been coming through. Some we've covered just over the course of. So one question is, what would happen if an astronaut on the ISS gets sick with something like appendicitis?
That's a very good question. One of the things that I kind of glossed over is in our medical training, we do actually have a fairly substantial medical kit, and that includes a lot of medications, antibiotics, the ability to do medical procedures like start an IV, draw blood. But one of the components that also is involved in it is a device called an ultrasound, and that is an imaging device. It's not the same as an X-ray. It's similar in that you can use it to look at what might be going on inside the body. So in the case that the question raised about an appendicitis, we would probably turn on the ultrasound and see if we could see and image the appendix to try to identify if that was the source of the problem. The other thing we can do is use the medicines that we have in the kit to help solve problems. The good thing about the specific example of an appendicitis is that's a fairly unlikely event in the age group that astronauts tend to be. An appendicitis typically happens in younger kids or teenagers, and then you tend to see a little bit more of it when people get a bit older, more towards retirement age. So that is an example of something that could happen, but it's not very likely. But the main point is we do have medical capability up there for the things that we do think are likely to happen. One example is someone either gets a tooth abscess or loses or has a cavity that causes a problem. We have some dental tools and equipment that we could use to help fix that kind of a scenario, antibiotics and other things that can help make it better. So we do spend a lot of time thinking about possible medical conditions and making sure that our kits have the right type of equipment in there.
Thank you for that. And I want to give a specific shout out because that question came from Gordon Garb from TEDx Sunnyvale. So thank you for tuning in to a fellow TEDx event. There was another question, I think, which we've sort of answered from that, which is, what are the lasting changes in the body that you can detect? I think when we talked about the year in space, we have that. Let's see. There are a few questions actually, and I don't know if you want to answer it or if it's within sort of your remit. What do you think about independent space companies like SpaceX getting traction? And I think there was a few questions on that, and one is sort of specifically on from a medical point of view. What do you think about independent companies coming into the space sector?
I think it's great. SpaceX is doing amazing things, both from the point of view of how they're advancing just rocket technology and engineering. I've had the opportunity to be at the Cape to see a launch of theirs, and it's pretty remarkable. And as your audience knows, they were recently successful with flying the first crew members. They were NASA astronauts that piloted the vehicle, but SpaceX was successful in getting their Dragon vehicle up there, docked to station. The crew stayed there, I believe, around 60 days, something like that, two or 3 months, something like that, and had a successful landing. So the whole, one of the roles of NASA is to help enable a space economy that would see private private astronauts, private vehicle companies going and coming from space. So in many ways, it's a more the merrier kind of thing. Uh, I think your questioner asked about medical at SpaceX, and they do have their own medical department. And I think their head doctor, I know him pretty well. He used to be a colleague of mine here at NASA, but they're doing, like I say, they're doing great work over there. And I think one of the other companies that you may have heard about is Virgin Galactic. They're soon to be launching their vehicle with passengers. Their mission profile is going to be a little bit different in that they're not going to be orbiting the Earth. They're going to do basically straight up and down flights where they bounce up into so that their passengers are technically in space, and then they return back down to their launch site. But again, one of NASA's missions is to help foster a space economy, and I think that's all great effort.
It must be fantastic, viewing the Earth from space. We see photos, of course, but if you're a space tourist, just to get all out of the atmosphere and seeing that must be fantastic. We've got a few pictures actually. Steve, what are we looking at here? This is the Soyuz.
Yeah, this is a view from the space station, and you can see there's a Soyuz and a Progress vehicle that are docked to some of the docking ports on the Russian segment of the station. And the picture is capturing, I believe it's equivalent to the Northern Lights, basically, but I think this is actually over the southern hemisphere, so I think the Aurora Australis is what it would be called. But that's ionizing radiation in the upper edges of the atmosphere that illuminates light. And again,
And the
there was another photo that was another photo from the station as well, overflying inhabited parts of the planet. You can see those are probably city lights over a populated area. But as you entered this, you bring up a good point, which is the value of perspective. And uh, many or most of all of the space flyers I know actually talk about how important it is to have this different perspective of the planet. Most of us, at best, we might fly on planes and get a couple mile in the sky, or a couple mile in the sky view of the Earth. But being able to get much further above the Earth and just see the environment, not as an inanimate object, but as a dynamic, changing event, I think that really has a big impact on how people view the impact that they're making on their local world here. This is a photo looking partially into a little bit of Myanmar and India. But like I said, one of the most famous photos that is associated with NASA is a photo called Earthrise, which was taken by the first Apollo crew that orbited the moon, and they took a photo of the Earth as they were coming out from behind the moon. And like I say, it's just a valuable perspective as you live your daily life, and to think about what kind of impact you're making to the environment and your fellow man around you. And I think that's one of the values that an observation platform that NASA has, or the space station is for the planet. I think that's an important perspective to bring to everyone.
Salween team, would you mind bringing back the photo, the browner of the two photos? Because I think we want to touch a bit on just that impact that we have on the environment. You know, we at least I think a lot of us grew up thinking we're so small compared to the Earth, so it doesn't quite matter. If you keep going, it's the photo with the rivers. It's the one where you can see the sort of a river delta, and the photo itself is quite brown. And if there's that one, so if you see along the bottom left, it's actually fires, isn't it, Steve? We looked at the it's quite well captioned, the photo, and this
Yeah,
is looking actually south. That's the Ganges Delta on the right, Bangladesh, and this is the small river in the front is actually the Chindwin, which is not so small, but these are fires going all along the mountain ridge, and that's probably probably human fires, probably something agriculture related, and just seeing just that amount of smoke that is then going towards the rest of the country. So this image is kind of flipped. We were looking for a few photos of Myanmar to show, and I was just struck by the fires and also the science element of space. Steve, I believe this photo was taken to conduct hydrology research on the Ganges Delta to see how that delta area is changing as captured from space. So there's just incredible scientific benefits of all these space flights as well.
absolutely.
What they
Like I said,
what, sorry, Steve, go ahead.
I was just going to reiterate, yeah, you can definitely observe these phenomenon of rivers moving, big changes in the environment that you just can't see from an in-person. It's really difficult to see from an in-person, on the ground perspective.
Okay, we're going to go on to a next segment, and we'll take more questions. So, one of the more dramatic aspects of space flight is actually reentry. So let's look at a few photos of reentry and have Steve tell us a little bit about what's happening. And so what is this?
This is a landing photograph from a Soyuz landing, and I believe this is one of the missions that I supported. Jeff Williams is a crew member, the NASA astronaut that's landing here. So this is a landing in Kazakhstan. Uh, Obviously, you can see there's snow on the ground, and it's right around the point where the capsule hits the ground. And the way that you're transported to the landing site is via helicopters, Mi-8s. There's I believe there's 10 to 12 of them that usually fly out to the landing site, and they transport people that come and to safe the vehicle, to recover the crew. There's also a medical team with us, and there's a temporary medical tent that's put up that we after the crew are out of the vehicle, we go to the medical tent and get them prepared to get back on these helicopters so that they can fly back to the airport in Kazakhstan where we leave to return home. This is a photo, as I mentioned, of Jeff Williams, who's a NASA astronaut who I had the great privilege to support on 2 flights to the International Space Station. And in this photo, he's been back on Earth after being gone for 6 months. He's been back probably for about 90 minutes, I would say, and we're looking out the window, getting ready to land at the airport where we'll meet a plane to, in this case, we were returning back to Russia to do reconditioning. This is a photo of a ceremony that they have after landing at the airport. And there's some local ceremony. Obviously, it takes an integrated team to support a landing. And you can see some of the crew are wearing some ceremonial gifts some hats on their head and a cape. They also get gifts from the local representatives there of customized Matryoshka dolls that have their faces on them. So it's a really fun event to celebrate having gotten back. We medically, crew are still at the beginning really of their reconditioning or readaptation phase after their bodies experience the changes of spaceflight. So we get a little bit of time with them before we go out for that ceremony, just to make sure they're ready and able to sit in the chairs there for the ceremony for a period of time, do a brief speech of thanks and gratitude before we get ready to leave again. So there's a couple immediate things medically that we're looking at. The first thing that crew typically experience, well, first of all, immediately after crew land, they're typically on a bit of an adrenaline rush, and so they're generally really happy, obviously, all smiles, feeling and looking pretty good. Yeah, this is a picture of Scott Kelly after his 1-year mission, and he's probably been on the ground here for maybe 30 minutes. But so after the sort of adrenaline rush wears off, and it depends on each individual crew, but some crew will experience, again, another symptom complex of motion sickness, and this is a result of their nervous system having not been exposed to gravity for the duration of their mission. Usually nowadays it's 6 months, but it takes a little bit of time for the brain and nervous system to readjust and tune back into having gravity around. And in the meantime, particular kinds of movements, head movements where they have to turn their head or to side or up and down, or if they have to walk quickly or try to turn a corner or climb stairs, that can provoke some motion sickness. So we're keeping a close eye on crew immediately after they return for this. And then the other main thing that we're looking for is, if you recall, I talked about earlier how their body fluids change and they don't need as much volume in their blood vessels and in their legs. So when they come back from space, they have what's called a relative dehydration. The total amount of fluid in them is lower than it normally would be for someone on the planet. And you add on top of that the fact that the reentry experience can involve a lot of heat stress, because the vehicle is being heated up really high on the outside of the vehicle, and the crew are also wearing their spacesuits, which have a lot of layers, and they don't. They typically have a ventilation system in them to help remove heat, but they do gain a bit of heat during the reentry process. So the point of that is they're already dehydrated before they come down, and then when they get to the ground, typically do a lot of sweating because it's pretty hot in the suits. And so we're after they get back and we get them in the tent, we're also making sure that their volume level or their fluid levels are good, so that there's not a risk for them getting faint or feeling faint or possibly passing out. And sometimes we encourage them to drink fluids by mouth, but sometimes we'll also need to give them an IV fluid bolus just to help them feel better and look better. So those are the main things we're looking at after they get back. I had a real kind of a funny story with Jeff there. We were at the landing site. You could imagine there's 100 people, maybe 150 people. It just depends on the landing and the time of year. But as I was talking to Jeff when he was sitting in the chair near the capsule, like in that picture with Scott, he said to me, "Hey Steve, can you hear that?" And I was not sure what he was talking about because all I could hear was this scrum of people milling around the capsule. And I said, "That's what I hear. I just hear all the people around." He's like, "No, behind that, it's quiet." And it didn't really make sense to me at first, but he later explained to me, I've been on the space station, which is essentially you're living in a machine, and the noise level there's always it's kind of like being on an aircraft in the air. There's always that background hum of engines running, pumps going. So he was excited to be back on the planet where he could get some not peace and quiet, but he could enjoy not hearing all this mechanical noise in the background.
So beyond the immediate landing, I assume then you continue medical care for them as they readjust back to the planet. Your brother says that one of the things that you have the crew do soon after is to shoot basketball free throws. Why do you do that? And what other things do you do with them?
Well, I'm a fan of basketball, and one of the crew I worked with, his name is Chris Cassidy. I worked with him when he was on. He's actually on the space station right now for a 6-month mission, but a few years ago he also did a six. He did another. He did his first 6-month mission on the space station, and he's also a basketball fan. So when he got back, I made a gentleman's bet with him that if he could make a free throw when he returned to Houston, and that was, even though they land in Kazakhstan, we get back to Houston roughly 24 hours later. So I made this gentleman's bet with him that if he could make a free throw on the first attempt, that he wouldn't have to do any of the post-flight testing and reconditioning that we do. And of course, I didn't think that he would have any chance of making one because, as I mentioned, your nervous system and balance and other things are a little bit off as you get back from space. But of course, Chris, without any concern, stepped up to the free throw line and went ahead and just swished his first free throw. He's a good guy, so he did actually go ahead with all the testing and reconditioning that we have astronauts do. But I think for when he gets back this next time, he's going to land from the mission that he's on right now on station. He'll land in October. I think I'm going to challenge him to make a 3-point basket and have the same wager in place. But in seriousness, for all crew, what we do a variety of things. One big component is a reconditioning program, and that usually lasts for about 45 days. And we want to make sure that crew members get back to the same physical level that they were before they left for their flight. And so they do a lot, as they did in flight, they do a lot of working out when they get back to make sure that their aerobic capacity is back up to where it was, to make sure that their strength and flexibility are back up to where they were. The other component of things that the crew are being tested on and doing is we draw blood, we do medical tests and exams just to make sure that we check out everything and that there's nothing new that's developed over the course of their time in space. And then the crew also participate and volunteer for a large complement of scientific investigations. And so in the immediate days and first month and a half or so post-flight, they can be doing a lot of testing related to those type of activities as well. But in general, we're getting MRI body scans and a variety of other imaging techniques to look and try to measure with some degree of exactness the types of changes that their bodies experience. And typically, this whole experience, people the astronauts and cosmonauts usually return to their pre-flight baseline within about 6 months. And the system that seems to take the longest is reabsorbing and the small amount of calcium that their skeletons lose or the bones lose while they're in space. That's what takes the longest. Most of the rest of the body systems return back to baseline within a few days to weeks.
Okay. And that includes, I guess, the muscular system. We did have a question of somebody saying, we heard that the astronauts' legs shrink when they're in space. And I think you're talking about a bit of atrophying of the muscles, which you mentioned earlier. It's countered by all the exercise that they do. But I don't know how much of the exercise in space compensates for the lack of gravity, and how much they still have to rebuild muscle and everything else.
We showed you the ARED, the Advanced Resistant Exercise device, and that does a great job. It's actually a second generation, again, if you will, exercise device. So the ARED is the machine that looks like a weightlifting machine, and that machine actually, it's way more capable than the astronauts are strong. So it does a great job of getting the crew workout. The primary limitation with it is that you can't exercise all the muscles that you might normally be able to. There's a limited set of exercises that you can do, is the other way to say it, but it does a good job of keeping muscle strength. Your questioner noted correctly that there is this skinny leg or chicken leg, if you will, notice of crew members' legs in space. And a lot of that is actually related to the changes in the body fluids, as I mentioned earlier, because your legs actually have a lot of extra space in them to maintain fluid to help you maintain a constant blood pressure. And so when you don't have gravity and don't need it, you actually lose some amount of volume in your legs. And that's more what your questioner's noticing and asking about than the muscle strength.
Fascinating. Never
Yeah.
knew that. So we'll wrap up soon, because I'm very conscious that it's quite late for you there. It's 11 o'clock, 11 p.m. your time. So maybe we'll just wrap up with question on, what missions you're working on right now, and if there's anything else that you wanted to tell the audience that we didn't cover.
Thank you. I'm working on a couple things. I continue to work with the space station program as one of the program medical officers there, and I help do some of the management in the division, the medical division, in which I work for the space station program. The next crew that I'll be working with as a crew surgeon is going to be the crew that flies on the new Boeing capsule that we saw a picture of earlier. So that mission is scheduled to launch in spring of 2021. Approximately, there may be a little bit of change in that, but it'll be sometime next spring or summer that the Boeing vehicle will fly with crew on it. So I'll be working with those individuals.
Fantastic. Thank you, Steve. I've learned so much. It's been amazing spending the last hour and a half with you. Again, any parting thoughts on what you might want the audience to take away that we might not have covered?
Well, in some respects, the work that I do, or working with astronauts, the astronauts, their mission often garners a lot of attention. But I'd encourage folks to go check out NASA.gov. NASA's doing a lot of things. Some of them involve human spaceflight. Some of them involve, for example, recently they launched or relaunched the Mars 2020 rover that was supposed to land on Mars in February of 2021. So they're doing Mars missions. They've got a plan for a great new space telescope called the James Webb Space Telescope that's going to be launching soon. And they're doing many other things. So if folks have an interest in NASA, I'd encourage them to go check out the site. And the other thing that I think is important to say um, to listeners is, I think I can only speak for myself, but I think that the agency is obviously interested in people that are interested in space and are good at what they do. And so NASA does lots of things. And so if folks are looking for ways to learn more about NASA or see NASA vehicles flying overhead, or even aiming for a future where they may want to work for NASA or even one of the other space companies, I'd encourage you to just follow what your interest is, be good at it, and keep the potential for a career in space in your mind. As we talked about at the very beginning, that was my experience. I grew up in a rural part of the United States, and these kind of space age things were just things that you saw in a book. But they're real programs, and like I said, we're always looking for capable people that are enthusiastic. So I encourage you guys again to nasa.gov and see the kinds of things we're doing, and hopefully we'll find something, or hopefully you'll be able to find something that appeals to you.
That's fantastic, because I think we did have a question earlier about somebody who's a computer science major, or somebody asking how a computer science major can get involved in NASA. And I would imagine NASA, there are so many different job functions that there will be a fit for people with a variety of backgrounds.
Absolutely. I'll give you a sort of an esoteric number for someone who's a computer science major. I think there was something like 3 million lines of code in the space station. And obviously computers and human machine interfaces and programming we couldn't do many of the things that we make look easy without a great understanding of computers and technology generally. So, like I said, there's a tremendous breadth of the type of careers that can work in space and at NASA. So, definitely encourage them to, or the questioner to continue to pursue that goal of becoming the best computer scientist they can be. And there's definitely opportunity here.
Great. I think that's a great note to end on. There's possibilities, opportunities, and there are fantastic careers out there and fantastic ways to really pursue your life, as we've heard from yourself and all the people that you work with. So thank you so much for sharing all that knowledge, all that experience, and for spending time with us today. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
So that was Dr. Stevan Gilmore, NASA flight surgeon, everyone. And thank you to all of you for tuning in. Thanks also for the Selwyn Group for the pro bono production that you do for this. And thanks to my fellow TEDxYangon core team volunteers who are prepared for this and manning this. We are continuing the series. It happens the first Sunday of every month. And the next Sunday, which will be the 4th of October, we will be welcoming U Aung Chicken, who runs Strategy First. He's an educator based in Myanmar. And that is, I'm very excited to say, the first conversation series that we'll be having so far in the Myanmar language. So we'll be putting out more information about that on our Facebook page, and look forward to welcoming all of you who are interested in education and who would like to hear it all in the Myanmar language to tune in. So see you on the 4th of October. Goodbye, everyone. Have a good rest of the weekend.